Sweet. All set?
Okay, before we, well, thank you all for coming. My name's Ben Montag, for any of you that don't know me. I'm a professor here in the Department of Art and Art History, and I had the privilege of curating this exhibition. I hope that for those of you that are in person, you got to walk around and work. For those of you that are joining us remotely, hopefully you were able to come see the exhibition already, and if not, it's only open till tomorrow, so hopefully you can come and see the work. So I want to thank you for coming, and then one of the pleasures of this exhibition is to have been able to collaborate with Quatez, who I'll let him introduce our speaker today, but it has been a wonderful collaboration, and I'm able to continue to do things. Quatez, Scott.
Sweet, no pressure. All right. All right. Well, thank you all for doing this virtually. But yeah, this has been a wonderful collaboration. Being able to have this important conversation, and these are other important conversations. We've had some high school students, we've had round table. We sat around in circles, talking about perceptions, what these ultimately mean in society, but then also to the significance. Talk about how do we progress as a society. Thankful for the opportunity. I also want to thank our Vice President of Inclusive Excellence, Dr. Matthew Cheney, who was comfortable not coming up and saying anything, but also helping to co-sponsor this event. And then, of course, thankful Dr. Alexander. His work is featured inside of my dissertation, so when you all read it, you'll see some of the things I have to say about his work. It's very, 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 very critical. And I hope that I did your work justice, Dr. Zamalin.
Thank you.
Go ahead and our speaker. Dr. Alex Zamalin is Associate Professor of Political Science and Director of African American Studies Program at University of Detroit Mercy. He's the author of 6 books: African American Political Thought and American Culture, The Nation's Struggle for Racial Justice, which was published in 2015. Struggle on Their Minds, The Political Thought of African American Resistance, published in 2017. Production, which I hold, published in 2019. Black Utopia, The History of an Idea, Black Nationalism to Afrofuturism, published in 2019 as well, which was named a 2020 Choice Outstanding Title by the American Library Association. And most recently, Against Civility, The Hidden Racism, Our Obsession with Civility, published earlier this year. Zamalin's most recent forthcoming book is All Is Not Lost, 20 Ways to Revolutionize Disaster, which will be published next year. In addition, he has been a guest on NPR and MSNBC, and his work has been featured in publications like The Guardian, ESPN's and Yes Magazine. Ladies and gentlemen, those who do not subscribe to any gender identity, I present to you Dr. Alex.
Hello. Good afternoon, everyone. Can everyone hear me okay? Yes? Okay.
Yes.
Fantastic. Thank you, Quatez. Thank you, Ben. Thank you, Wright State. I am incredibly excited to be here, delighted to be sharing my work, and also incredibly grateful for the opportunity to discuss some of these important concepts, themes, ideas, which I hope will generate productive discussion at the university and in your communities. So today, I'd like to talk a little bit about the relationship between Black political thought and anti-racism, or what I call the civic radical tradition. Next slide, please. Thank you. So to begin, it's important to center our conversation around a specific tradition, and that is Black political thought in the United States. When we talk about various frames, various lenses of interpretation, it's often helpful to think through not simply what the arguments of a particular tradition might be, but the specific context in which a tradition arises. And so throughout my work, one of the things that I try to highlight consistently is that Black political thought, given the unique experience of Black Americans in the United States, Black political thought has a very specific, precise understanding of theory and politics and interpretation, which is important to understand and foreground. And throughout my work, one of the arguments that I try to make is that Black political thought is an indispensable tool and lens for thinking through not only questions of race, power, equality, and freedom in the United States, but also broader questions around the meaning of the US, the meaning of identity. What does it mean to live in a community? What does it mean to experience solidarity? And one of the reasons why I argue that Black political thought is unique in its vantage point is precisely because it comes with a specific orientation to the world. And here are some of the core and constituent features of Black political thought. They are, first, the idea of decolonizing critique. We often think of critique and critical work as something that can be taken up and undertaken through a kind of universalist lens. All of us on some level can interpret the world and give good or bad reasons for that interpretation. Black political thought begins with the understanding that it's important to unmoor critique and interpretation from the specific investments it has in a history of white supremacy, racism, imperialism, colonialism. So all of the thinkers that I have on this slide, Malcolm X, Ella Baker, who's the great leader of SNCC, James Baldwin, and Angela Davis, despite the fact that they come from different time periods and make different arguments, all agree that decolonizing criticism is a crucial enterprise that is necessary in the world. All of these thinkers and Black political thought also has a unique perspective, which scholars describe as being part of Afro-modernity. The Afro-modern tradition is distinct from the Euro-modern tradition, which prioritizes ideas of progress, teleology, uncomplicated freedom. Euro-modern thinkers exist in a world where they're either blind to race or don't think about race and racial domination in serious and profound ways. Whereas Black political thinkers, part of the experience of Afro-modernity, responding to the experience of enslavement and resistance to that enslavement, believe that there needs to be a different vantage point than simply assuming that progress will be achieved easily, that freedom exists without struggle, that democracy is easily attainable through certain institutional fixes like the right to vote, greater representation. Black political thought, in other words, offers a perspective that calls for resistance, struggle, and the continued work necessary not only to achieve freedom and equality, but to expand democracy for all those who are dispossessed. Next slide, please. Thank you. With this vantage point, I began to think about a specific question, which occupied my work over the past couple of years. And that is, how does Black political thought think about the question of civility? And to me, this was a profound question, partly because over the past 5 or 6 years, there has been a turn in American political discourse to champion certain ideas of respectability, bipartisanship, democracy, liberalism, and consensus, which for many across the political aisle are seen as uncontroversial. This was especially acute after 2016 and the election of Donald Trump raised all sorts of questions around what kind of norms are permissible, acceptable in political discourse. What kind of a society do we want to live in as Americans? And what should the role of civility be? As I began to consider the embrace of civility in public discourse, I began to think about what would the Black tradition, what would Black political thought think about civility? But this wasn't simply an abstract question, for there was a long and durable history of Black political thinkers responding to the question and problem of civility. Is civility a value to embrace? Is bipartisanship, compromise, something that citizens ought to be invested in? Is civility a crucial instrument for achieving not only justice, but specifically racial justice? And this was a question that I think took up great urgency in the last couple of years, precisely because many believed that the only way to achieve justice and freedom in the United States, specifically racial justice, was more civility. So the question that I began to think through from a historical perspective is this politically justified? Are the thinkers, Black political thinkers, who've had the best arguments for thinking through race in America, how do they respond to this question of civility in America? Next slide. It turned out, on some level, even though I was surprised as I began to read more and more into this, was throughout history, Black political thought has had a decisively critical interpretation of civility. Black political thinkers, Frederick Douglass, Martin Luther King, Ida Wells, throughout their particular historical moments, recognized the way that civility became a powerful tool to distract from racial inequality. So if you look at the bottom hand, right-hand corner, that's an image, for those of you who don't know, of John C. Calhoun, who was a vice president of the United States under Andrew Jackson, and in many ways was one of the leading intellectuals and defenders of the slaveholding class. In 1837, Calhoun gave a famous speech in the US Senate when he was senator, where he argued that the greatest threat to American freedom was the incivility of abolitionists who were growing in numbers. William Lloyd Garrison and his New England Anti-Slavery Society had almost 300,000 members. Frederick Douglass was achieving prominence as a national orator, an abolitionist. David Walker penned an important text in 1829 called The Appeal, which argued for resistance against enslavement. And at this very moment, when there is great energy percolating from below, great democratic energy trying to topple the regime of slavery, John C. Calhoun calls for civility. He calls for compromise. And his argument is that the greatest threat to the nation is not slavery, which enslaves 3 million people, but instead abolition. And so this became not only the first major instance of civility being weaponized, used to distract from inequality in American history, but it was part of a long tradition. This wasn't only the right or conservatives who were invested in this particular strategy. It was also moderates. On the left, for example, you see an image of Ulysses S. Grant, who was a general of the Union Army. When Ulysses S. Grant came into office, came into power in 1869, one of his great promises was that he would allow bygones to be bygones. He would allow the South to move on, to not have to seriously atone for the crime of slavery. And in many ways, it wasn't surprising that by the time he left office and began writing his memoirs, the president who came after, Rutherford B. Hayes, called an end to Reconstruction on the same ideal, which was civility was more important than racial justice. And then in the 1960s, of course, one of the great examples of civility being used to silence dissent, being used to distract from racial inequality, was through the Albany, Georgia police chief, Lori Pritchett, who you see in that picture, standing before Martin Luther King. In a famous media appearance, Pritchett gathered with anti-racist protesters like King and civil rights activists and prayed with them and allowed for the media to watch this collective prayer. Pritchett, at the same time as he was authorizing the gnashing teeth of white supremacy, was more than willing to use civility as a tool, as a political tool, to suggest that there was far more unity between the white supremacists that he was representing and the anti-Black and the anti-racist protesters that were pushing against it. This was yet another example, a long history of how civility has been used time and time again to racialize inequality, but also to suppress dissent when it is percolating from below. Next slide. It's not simply, however, that civility distracts from inequality. It's also crucial to recognize the way that it enforces violence and terror. And I want to draw you to the example of the late 1800s. This was a time in American history when there was great promise that was not only left unfulfilled through the Supreme Court decision of Plessy v. Ferguson in 1896, which rendered constitutional separate but equal, but there was also a great feeling among anti-racists that hope was lost, precisely because there was a dramatic rise in lynching, which became one of the main ways in which white supremacy was able to reinstantiate itself in the South. And it wasn't only lynching, it was a forcible campaign enacted by white militias. For instance, on the bottom left, in 1898, there was what came to be known as the Wilmington Race Massacre, in which a gang of 2,000 white people overthrew a democratically elected Black government in Wilmington, North Carolina. And what was their reasoning? What was their rationale for engaging in such violent behavior? It was, as the record indicates, a need to restore civility. So figures in Wilmington, on the top right-hand corner, you see Pitchfork Ben Tillman, who in 1876 made his political chops by engaging in the Hamburg Massacre, which led to the killing of several Black citizens. Pitchfork Ben Tillman later becomes a senator of South Carolina, and in 1903 comes before the US Senate and argues that lynching is justifiable precisely because it is a protection of the honor of white women. No one understood this to be a myth as much as Ida B. Wells, who you see on the left-hand side, who was one of the great crusaders against lynching. And Ida B. Wells was unafraid of speaking out against both the Wilmington Race Massacre and figures like Ben Tillman by arguing in a very uncivil way. She was unafraid to hold her tongue. She would speak in a prophetic register. She would argue that civility, as it is being deployed by those in power, actually leads to a condition of violence and terror. And it strengthens weak regimes who promise law and order through violence and a restoration of civility, but really, as Ida B. Wells says, are doing nothing more than trying to cover up the weakness that exists in their movements. So it became clear to me that as I was thinking about how Black political thinkers respond to the question of civility, that response was almost uniformly negative and critical, partly because as Black political theorists began to recognize, civility was a powerful weapon that those in power could use. Why? Because once you begin to think about a world that is civil and uncivil, moral and immoral, that traffics quite well with the discourse of racism, Black and white, good and evil, pure and not. All of this, for Black political thinkers, is precisely what allows for civility to fit so seamlessly with an unjust status quo, to create a condition of violence and suffering for Black citizens, and to make it difficult for people of color in the United States to gain freedom, which is why, if you look at the right-hand side at the bottom, that's an image of a prison, a jail. In the 1970s and 1980s, it became clear that one strategy of the new right would be to call for greater civility in political discourse, which is what Richard Nixon promised in his 1968 campaign, to squash out, as he put it, the Black rebellion, to restore order in the streets. And as a consequence, first Nixon, then Reagan began to push for a politics that restored civility through more police officers, restored civility through the expansion of prisons. So much so that by 1980, there were 200,000 people incarcerated in US prisons. By 2010, 30 years later, there were 2 million. And so civility has continued throughout history to be used not to further equality, but as the language for reinforcing inequality. Next slide, please. So this brings us to a question. If not civility, then what? Part of what I discovered as I began to write the book and look at the long history of Black political thought was that the distinction between civil and uncivil was misguided. The distinction between civil and uncivil, or moral and immoral, was wrong. Black political thinkers historically had an alternative conception of political action and discourse, and that was based in what I call civic radicalism. For Black political thought, it's not enough to simply call out people based on their moral behavior or their decorum or whether they're respectable enough or not. What's crucial is adopting a specific orientation in the world that demands racial justice, that demands liberation, that does not traffic in equivocations, that does not assume that compromise is possible with those who are hostile to Black dignity. And so the civic radical tradition is a tradition that is anti-racist, but it is also a tradition that has a specific set of features to it. The first of which is that it's pragmatic. What this means is that throughout history, throughout Black political thought and action, whether it's Frederick Douglass, who at first begins to think that it's possible to go to the negotiating table with the ruling class, but later comes to believe that the only way to defeat slavery is through collective mobilization and power, and through striking, and sometimes through a certain kind of militant activity. Or Martin Luther King in the 1960s, who at first believes that the only way, or one possible way, of dealing with white supremacy is through appealing to white citizens' moral consciousness. But eventually he comes to understand that there's a limit to what many white people will accept and be comfortable with. So there needs to be a more direct confrontation in the streets. And that's his argument in the late 1960s, up until the time he's assassinated. Pragmatism, in other words, being able to change your tactics, being able to be flexible in your thought, is a crucial aspect of civic radicalism. So too is intersectionality. We often hear the term today, which is associated with Black Lives Matter, but in many ways, intersectionality is an old idea, which stems from Black feminists like not only Ida B. Wells, but Anna Julia Cooper, Sojourner Truth, these activists, Maria Stewart, who were involved in the Black freedom struggle in the 19th century, who argued that it was not enough to simply think about the liberation of folks who were economically dispossessed or those who were racialized. It was important to think about the intersections between race, gender, class, as well as sexuality. In addition to intersectionality, civic radicalism believes in the importance of re-signifying political ideas. This is one thing that you see constantly. What Frederick Douglass, what W.B. Du Bois, what Angela Davis mean by freedom is quite different than what many Euromoderns think of freedom. A Euromodern, let's say, like Abraham Lincoln, might believe that freedom is simply being able to do what you like to do without there being any imposition by the state in your everyday life. For Angela Davis, for Martin Luther King, freedom means nothing without basic resources, without healthcare, without being free from violence in your community, without basic community resources, without having some kind of dignity. All of this for King and Davis are non-negotiable when we're thinking about freedom. And so part of the civic radical tradition is to re-signify core ideas that Americans take for granted: freedom, equality, justice, and to argue that there is a more robust understanding of these terms, a more inclusive understanding of these terms, an understanding that cannot be limited to one group of people or one class, so on, needs to be expanded. The fourth aspect of civic radicalism is depersonalizing politics. Today, we often think, and this is connected with the move towards civility, that the real solution to our political problems lies in everyday encounters, having better conversations, being more civil, engaging in more open conversation. The civic radical tradition doesn't completely discard the importance of these aspects, but instead prioritizes, places on a higher level action and mobilization. It's less important to sit down with your adversary or with someone who you disagree with, so says the civic radical, and much more important to be invested in policies, to be invested in collective action with others, so that you can create, in the words of Martin Luther King, a beloved community here in the United States. In addition to depersonalizing politics, there's also a systematizing of critique. What this means is that civic radicals look at structures, look at policies, and rather than asking what exactly one might think deep within their hearts and the extent to which they're able to experience compassion, love, etc., they want to focus on the structures that are in place that promote or debilitate the potential for citizens to be free. Next slide, please. what I've just described is what we can call a kind of political philosophy of civic radicalism. But what exactly is the politics? The politics is one of disruption. The politics is one of occupation. What does all this mean? It means on some level, and this is important, that all civic radical movements begin with the understanding that the only way to confront power is through collective mobilization. You take a look at the anti-slavery movement. The reason why the anti-slavery movement was able to be successful, so says W.B. Du Bois, was not simply because you had Black citizens join the Union Army, but it was precisely because you had a whole class of citizens, Black workers who were enslaved, who refused to show up to work. They took matters into their own hands. They took labor into their own hands and withdrew it from the system. This was a deeply disruptive act. According to W.B. Du Bois in his classic book, Black Reconstruction in America, this is one of the first general strikes when Black citizens refused to put their labor into the system of slavery. At the same time, during the era of enslavement, you have the Underground Railroad, which is famously led by Harriet Tubman. This is a disruptive act that creates a tremendous amount of risk for Tubman. She goes down into occupied territory 17 times. And it's well known that as she's bringing fugitives across the Mason-Dixon line, she warns them that they cannot speak or she might shoot them. For Tubman, this is a serious act. This is not something to be taken lightly. There's a certain kind of vulnerability that goes into being an activist, so says the civic radical. But the only way that slavery is toppled, according to civic radicalism, is through disruptive activity that is collective. You take a look at the civil rights movement. I have some images here of, for instance, SNCC, upper right-hand corner, the Greensboro sit-ins, bottom-hand corner. You look at these famous moments of robust student activism and activity. What these citizens were doing was occupying public spaces. They were engaging in sit-ins, boycotts, strikes. SNCC was famously organizing freedom schools without the sanction of the community. They were politicizing the meaning of what it meant to be a sharecropper. Many sharecroppers in Alabama and Mississippi were not afforded dignity, equal wages, and had to experience racism on a daily basis. That's why on the bottom left-hand side, Hosea Hudson organized the Right to Vote Club in 1937 as part of the Black labor movement. And Hosea Hudson believed that the only way to confront the racism of the main labor movement, which was the American Federation of Labor, the AFL, was through mobilizing and organizing at the grassroots in Alabama. So Hudson went into the Deep South where he was from and organized and unionized steelworkers and created one of the first Black steel unions that actually won some important victories. Voting enfranchisement increased. There was a real push for equal wages. And according to Hudson, this would have been impossible without disruptive action. A similar argument is being made today by the prison abolition movement. If you look at the top left, you see the call for stop criminalizing our communities or no new jails. The prison abolitionist movement argues that the only way to change the structure of mass incarceration in the United States is by directly confronting all of the systemic inequalities and injustices that are in existence, whether it's the school to prison pipeline, whether it's the lack of resources and opportunities, whether it's a lack of healthcare, whether it's the criminalization of Blackness, which we see time and time again. All of this, according to critical resistance and the prison abolitionist movement, is about disrupting, occupying, and engaging in politics that is civic radical rather than civil. Next slide, please. The one thing to keep in mind throughout the long history of race in America and how Black political thinkers have thought about civility and race is that civility is more often than not regularly deployed and much more part of our public discourse precisely when revolutionary anti-racist movements are on the rise. So you can draw a direct link between a moment in American history when the status quo is being shaken up, when there is real potential for transformation. There's no mistake that the call for civility increased exponentially right after Black Lives Matter took the nation by storm and facilitated what came to be known as one of the biggest, if not the biggest, protest in American history in terms of sheer numbers and participation having to do with justice in America. It's precisely at that time when the youth, when those who want justice, when those who are seeking freedom feel emboldened, that civility is deployed with much more regularity, that it starts to enter our national conversation. But the important thing to note by studying Black political thought is that rather than being a sign of strength, it's actually a sign of weakness of the current regime. Those who continue to call for civility are simply trying to silence the energy, the democratic energy that is percolating from below. There's real possibility and opportunity for collective transformation. And that sometimes polarization need not actually lead to an unsustainable condition. The slavery era was a moment of polarization. The anti-lynching era, the Jim Crow era, the civil rights era. Today, all of these moments are moments when there's heightened polarization. Black political thought argues that polarization only becomes a problem precisely because those who are seeking justice are getting closer than ever before. These movements are always around, but it's precisely when there's energy that polarization is, by the standard of the mainstream, seen to be a problem. It's seen to be disruptive. And so what we need is more civility. Next slide, please. I'd like to kind of, in brief, summarize with a quote from James Baldwin. Okay? This is James Baldwin writing in The Fire Next Time. He says, "Love takes off the masks that we fear we cannot live without and know we cannot live within. I use the word love here not merely in the personal sense, but as a state of being or a state of grace. Not in the infantile American sense of being made happy, but in the tough and universal sense of quest and daring and growth." And there's another quote here by Angela Davis. "A necessary step in winning greater freedom and greater justice is to imagine the world as we want it to be." So part of the civic radical work of re-signifying values, political ideas, has to do with embracing a new language, a language that takes seriously certain concepts, love, justice, freedom, etc., but at the same time is also willing to take seriously a resignification of these ideas and try to make them more real than ever before. I'd like to conclude, final slide, because I know we have some questions and I'd love to hear your questions. One more slide, please. With a kind of general framework. How do we think about civic radicalism? How do we think about Black Lives Matter and the question of an anti-racist future? I think based on the experience of history, there are several lessons we can take for how to think about the durability of anti-racist movements or civic radical movements today and in the future. I think one of the core concepts is that resistance to an unjust status quo must be institutionalized. What this means is that movements who are on the front line, who are on the ground calling for a change to systemic injustice and racism, need to continue that push. There, on the one hand, needs to be an engagement with power, with Congress, with elected officials, but at the same time, politics cannot be, or institutional politics cannot be, the only avenue of registering one's claims, precisely because, as we've described today, often those in power resort to the language of civility and silence and discipline and marginalize those who are seeking change. The third is the extent to which anti-racists can embrace the language of democracy and remake it to serve their interests. Think here about the previous slide with Angela Davis and James Baldwin. As well as collective mobilization, the extent to which activists can get on the streets, can engage in prophetic critique of the system, can argue for a rejuvenated sense of the world through having their bodies out on the street, is the extent to which anti-racism will succeed in the future. And finally, one thing that we've seen throughout the long history of civic radical organizing is that it's crucial to seize the language of the future. Too often, now and before, there's widespread pessimism, hopelessness. There's this feeling that somehow a future is out of reach, that democracy will never come to be here in the United States, that all there is just an endless cascade of dispossession, inequality, hopelessness, etc. Civic radicalism argues that it's important to not only defend the importance of the future, but to argue that the future is absolutely an indispensable concept and idea. And to never, according to the civic radical tradition, let the future be seized by those who want to have no future. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Cortez, the sound keeps cutting out.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, now I can. Yes.
All
yes.
right. So it's like weird because I'm trying to like, yeah. So we have about 9 people that are here in person, or no. So if any that are here virtually, please feel free to ask. But we'll also open up the floor. We have about 15 minutes for any questions that anyone may have. I'll get us started because one of the things I like that you just said is that we have to embrace the language of the future. And for me, you as a historian, you talked a lot about resistance has been a huge aspect to how we have realized democracy within America, but how we have also progressed as a country as well. So I think that what you've shown is that resistance is one of the pieces of language of the future. And it's part of what we see here with the monument. You can't see it here, but a lot of these monuments and the defacing of a lot of them has been acts of resistance. Can you talk about, why that is so important and what we mean when we talk about resistance? Because like you said, we throw in the language of civility when it's not about resistance per se, but a resistance to what?
Mm-hmm. That's a really great question. Thank you, Cortez. I really appreciate that. I think what I'd say is that, anytime you're thinking about resistance, you have to think about what the status quo is, what the historical context is, And more precisely, what is the yes? Not only what is the no, but what is the yes? So when you think about the various attempts that Black political thinkers have engaged in, whether it's Frederick Douglass trying to dismantle the regime of slavery, whether it's Ida B. Wells trying to confront the epidemic of lynching, all of them, on the one hand, are saying no to a very particular configuration of Black life, a very particular configuration of American politics. That's what they're saying no to. But at the same time, embedded in their particular resistance, saying no to, is also a yes. It's a yes of the future. It's a yes that comes into existence without a world in which racism and white supremacy is constantly ever present. So when Black political thinkers try to offer a yes, it is a yes without racism. It is a yes without white supremacy. And that is an incredibly difficult line to negotiate, because one of the things that Black political thinkers try to navigate throughout history is, how do you at once get a public to recognize the horrors of racial domination and to be able to register your claims as a citizen? But at the same time, how do you create a future-oriented language that is about justice, that is about freedom, is about liberation? And I think that it's valuable to study not only political movements like Douglass, like King, but also various forms of artistic expression. I mean, you have this wonderful exhibit. I also think of Jacob Lawrence, and I think of Romare Bearden. I think of these Black artists, Billie Holiday, Ella Fitzgerald, who are engaged in a certain kind of cultural work that acts as both a resistance to the status quo, but also an embrace of something different. So when I think of something like Strange Fruit, Billie Holiday's famous critique and memorialization of lynching, it's Holiday's voice that is enacting that resistance. And what she's dramatizing is not only the violent specter of racism and violence and resisting that, but at the same time, by virtue of the lyrics that she puts forward in her voice, in her performance, she's also modeling a future in which there could be a certain kind of freedom, and there could be a certain kind of process of bearing witness to violence that does not escape or cannot be surrounded by hopelessness.
Thank you. Does anyone here have any questions for Dr. Zamalin? Gail? I'll repeat it. Ooh, could you hear that, Dr. Zamalin?
No, I'm sorry. I
Actually,
couldn't
could
hear.
you repeat that to him yourself? Yeah, like, the way that you just framed all of that. You want to come up here and say it? Yeah. No, it's a great question. I like the way that you framed it. I don't want.
Yeah, sorry. I was just wondering how you form, in the past, there have been so many different ways of which there is something that we are fighting against. Resistance was fighting against slavery, against all of these different places. Right now, it seems like we're in a place where the object is not as obvious. White supremacy is such a huge thing. How do we find that focal point to resist? Or how does that come up in society with the critical thought?
Yeah, I mean, thank you. I really appreciate that question. I think that there are certain kinds of processes throughout history, certain kinds of experiences which can provide lessons. So you think of how was it that the civil rights movement was able to achieve a certain level of success? It was partly because they were able to pressure the public into understanding that white supremacy was intolerable, that Jim Crow was intolerable, that Jim Crow produced Emmett Till, it produced Bloody Sunday, it produced all kinds of violence. And so part of what the civil rights movement was trying to do was not respond to every aspect of racial inequality, but to draw attention to certain nexuses of inequality, such as police brutality, such as the criminalization of Black youth, violence directed against them, as well as segregation. So when you think about today and Black Lives Matter, part of what Black Lives Matter is trying to do is draw attention, despite, I think, as you correctly put it, the dispersed nature of racism. It's trying to draw attention to specific nexuses of oppression. And that, of course, is the system of mass incarceration, police brutality, and widespread economic inequality, which has become more prevalent over the past couple of years with COVID and has been given more of a kind of clear picture. It's always existed, but now it's become much clearer. And so on some level, what successful movements in the past have done was try to put pressure on specific institutions in order to force those institutions to reckon with injustices that they tolerate. And even if mass incarceration, police brutality are only tips of a much larger historical problem, what you see Black Lives Matter activists and Movement for Black Lives activists doing is trying to locate the conversation, to try to locate the frame into a very specific context. Does that make sense?
Yes, and I'm glad that Dr. LaPearl, I actually was getting ready to ask a similar question, but it's over in the chat. But she says that, well, one, this is such a brilliant and inspiring talk. It really was. I wish I've taken a class with you. But as an academic, what do you see as the single most important policy or strategy to pursue? I was also interested in that because most of the folks who are in here right now, we either work in inclusive excellence or we have folks that are in video wise that are logged in who are part of the President's Council on Inclusive Excellence or the Racial Equity Task Force that we have here. So we're looking at it in an educational aspect. But for instance, like she says, there's constantly a move to an anti-racist classroom and revision of pedagogy. Has this worked or contained activism between students and teachers, sometimes diluting the more systemic work? Where is where is it best to put pressure, disruption within the academic context? She has two great questions.
These are fantastic questions. Thank you so much, Dr. LaPearl. Really appreciate the question and your comments. I think that, again, it's important to take a lesson. And this is why, as a historian, as a political theorist, but also an intellectual historian, I think it's so crucial to look at the past. I mean, nothing that we confront is ever entirely new. And that's one thing I think that is often missing from the discourse. There's this feeling that somehow every new event, every new experience is out of history, it's out of time. But the one thing that you see, for instance, is that anti-racism historically has been integrally connected, and the Black freedom struggle has been connected deeply to the politics of education. For instance, in the late 19th century, the formation of the Black press, the formation of important newspapers like the Chicago Defender, which had 1 million Black readers across the nation in the 19-teens and 1920s. This was about creating a space through which to discuss problems of racism and racial liberation. You think about, for instance, in the 1960s, the creation of the freedom schools with SNCC. How did they work? They tried to model a certain kind of democratic existence that took everyone and everyone's position seriously, that began with a call and response, that took elements from the prophetic tradition of the Black church and tried to integrate it into how education was re-examined. You think of figures like Bob Moses, Ella Baker, all of these activists were engaged in the work of education. So the first thing I'd say is that generally this, you're absolutely right. This isn't new. There's been a long history of Black activists pointing to the relationship between anti-racism and education. At the same time, the most successful struggles to disrupt or challenge racist ways of being were when there were coalitions of those who cared about these issues coming together. So you take a look at the 1960s. The reason why the first Black Studies department was founded in San Francisco State University in the late 1960s was because students, faculty, white allies all came together and said, we need Black studies. They didn't simply go to the administration and say, would you consider this? They articulated the importance of this curriculum to them, not only to them, to the whole community, by enacting certain kinds of politics. They engaged in sit-ins, they engaged in protests. They were on campus talking about the importance at a time in the 1960s when race was on everyone's mind, talking about the importance of having a curriculum that identified the centrality of race and anti-racism, specifically through voices of color. So part, I think, of the lesson drawn from history is that the action needs to be collective. It needs to be, on some level, connected to many different spheres. Part of what the student movement showed us was that it wasn't only about Black studies, it was about gender studies. It was about trying to respond to economic inequality. It was about responding to war, which was an ongoing problem in the 1960s during Vietnam. So all of this was part of an interconnected intersectional conversation around activism as well as the meaning of education. So the fact, for instance, that there's pushback against so-called critical race theory from elements of the conservative right or the moderate left shouldn't be surprising. We've seen this time and time again in the 1990s. This isn't the first time that Toni Morrison was banned or canceled. In the 1990s, there was a huge uproar in conservative circles around Toni Morrison being taught after she was awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature. In the 1990s, the key terms were down with multiculturalism, down with political correctness. Today, it's a new vocabulary, but again, the content and the ideas are the same. And so the way to successfully call for an anti-racist politics or trying to take seriously a kind of anti-racist and inclusive educational curriculum is by resisting first the tendency to assume that everything is disconnected from history, but also to recognize that there are effective strategies that have worked. And often those who are critical of these projects are in the minority and their arguments aren't exceptionally strong. And so if there's resolve to combat racism in the curriculum, or if there's resolve to engage in collective action to call for a more anti-racist curriculum, it's within reach. None of this is sort of beyond the pale or outside of the realm of possibility.
Well, Dr. Zamalin, thank you so much for joining us here today.
Thank you. I really appreciate it.
Another round of applause for the folks that are.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Cortez. Thank you. Thank you for organizing this. I am so grateful. It was such a pleasure to be able to spend this hour chatting with you, sharing some of my thoughts, and I appreciate you coming out, whether in person or online. So thank you so much.
Yeah, no problem. And for folks who are not familiar with Dr. Zamalin, seriously, you should definitely read his books. I have a couple of I have a couple of them myself. But then also too, like when I've watched your videos and everything, you just seem like one of the most genuine people. And I love like how responsive you are to emails and all of that, because sometimes it's very difficult when it comes to other folks.
Sure, sure.
But
We should
thank
keep
you
in
all. And I'll,
touch. Keep in touch, Cortez. Keep in
oh,
touch, okay?
oh, for sure. You let it out there and it's public now, so I will definitely
Yes,
do that.
yes, yes, yes.
The one thing that I dislike about anything in a virtual space is that it just cuts off. So, so thank you all for joining us here today. Thank you, Dr. Zamalin. And for everyone that's out there, call to action for all of us is always to just continue doing the work and having the conversations. So thank you all very much, and you all enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.
Yep.